right, so chapter 252, I'm just going to sum up for you because while it wasn't violent or overly graphic, it was still a little bit unpleasant. We all know the Marquis of Holmesford was a licentious, misogynistic, horrible, awful person, right? And any hope that we had that that would change it all in death um, does not come to fruition. He was running off to that part of his house where he kept the women that we got some glimpses of in the chapter when he brought Mr. Greenwood there. So he goes there and he's like, "Hey, girls," and they're like, "You look like you're dying," and he's like, "I totally am." And he had brought some money for them so that they could have something to live on after he died, and then was like, "I want you to sing and dance for me while I die here," and so they did, and he did, and he was like, "Yay! I got to die in this place of licentiousness, woohoo." So weird, right? But that's how that chapter went. And that's the end of the Marquis of Holmesford. Because we're reaching the end of this story, the authors are kind of wrapping up the various plot lines, and that wraps up his. So I'm going to jump from there right to chapter 253. So chapter 253, the ex-member for Rottenborough. It was now the middle of April, 1843. The morning was fine, and the streets were marked with the bustle of men of business, clerks, and others repairing to their respective offices, when Mr. George Montague Greenwood turned from St. Paul's Churchyard into Cheapside. He was attired in a plain, and even somewhat shabby manner. There was not a particle of jewelry upon him, and a keen eye might have discovered, in the tout ensemble of his appearance, that his toilette had been arranged with every endeavour to produce as good an effect as possible. Thus his neckcloth was tied with precision seldom bestowed upon a faded piece of black silk. His shirt cuffs were drawn down so as to place an interval of snowy white between the somewhat threadbare sleeve of the blue coat and the common grey glove of Berlin wool. A black riband hung around his neck and was gathered at the ends in the right pocket of the soiled satin waistcoat, so as to leave the beholder in a state of uncertainty whether it were connected with a watch or only an eyeglass, or indeed with anything at all. And the Oxford mixture trousers, rather wide at the knees, were strapped tightly over a pair of well-blackened bluchers, and a casual observer would certainly have taken for Wellingtons. In his hand he carried a neat black cane, and his gait was characterized by much of the self-sufficiency which had marked it in better days. It was, however, far removed from a swagger. Greenwood was too much of a gentleman in his habits to fall into the slightest manifestation of vulgarity. His beautiful black hair, curling and glossy, put to shame the brownish hue of the beaver hat, which had evidently seen some service, and had lately been exposed to all the varieties of weather peculiar to this capricious climate. His face, eminently handsome, as we have before observed, was pale and rather thin, but there was a haughty assurance in the proud curl of the upper lip, and a fire in his large dark eyes, which showed that hope was not altogether a stranger to the breast of Mr. George Montague Greenwood. It was about 9:15 in the morning when this gentleman entered the great thoroughfare of Cheapside. Perhaps there is no street in all London which presents so many moral phases to the eyes of the acute beholder as this one, and at that hour, inasmuch as those eyes may single out, and almost read the pursuit of every individual forming an item in the dense crowd that is then rolling onward to the vicinity of the Bank of England, for of every 10 persons 9 are proceeding in that direction. Reader, let us pause for a moment and examine the details of the scene to which we allude, for Greenwood has slackened his pace, his eye has caught sight of the bow clock, and he perceives that he is yet too early to commence the visits which he intends to make in certain quarters. And first, gentle reader, behold that young man with the loose taglioni and no undercoat. He has a devil-may-care kind of look about him, mingled with an air of seediness, as if he had been up the best part of the night at a free and easy. He is smoking a cigar at that hour of the morning, and it is impossible to gaze at him for 2 seconds without being convinced that he is an articled clerk to an attorney, and that he doesn't care so long as he reaches the office just 5 minutes before the governor arrives. But that old man with the threadbare suit of black and the red cotton handkerchief sticking so suspiciously out of his pocket as if he had something wrapped up in it, who is he? Mark how he shuffles along, dragging his heavy high-lows over the pavement at a pace too speedy for his attenuated frame, and see with what anxiety he looks up at the clock projecting out far overhead to assure himself that he shall yet be at his office within 2 minutes of 9:30, or else risk his place and his 18 shillings a week which it brings him in, and on which he has to support a wife and a large family. He is a copying clerk in a lawyer's office. There can be no doubt of it, the poor man has his dinner wrapped up in his pocket handkerchief. Do you observe that proud, pompous-looking stout man, with the large yellow cane in his hand and the massive chain and seals hanging from his fob? He is a stockbroker who, having got up a bubble railway company, has enriched himself in a single day after having struggled against difficulties for 20 years. But see, a fashionably dressed gentleman, with a little too much jewelry about his person and a rather too severe swagger in his gait, overtakes our stout friend, and passes his arm familiarly in his as he wishes him good morning. There is no mistake about this individual. He is the managing director of the stockbrokers' company, and was taken from a 3-pair back in the New Cut to preside at the board. Arcades ambo, a precious pair. Glance a moment at that great, stout, shabbily dressed man, whose trousers are so tight that they certainly never could have been made for him, and whose watery, boiled kind of eyes, vacant look, and pale but bloated face denote the habitual gin drinker. He rolls along with a staggering gait as if the effects of the previous night's debauch had not been slept off, or as if he had already taken his first dram. He is on his way to the neighborhood of the bank, where he either loiters about on the steps of the auction mart or at the door of Capel Court, or else proceeds to some public-house parlor which he frequents. His business is to hawk bills about for discount, and to hear him speak, one would believe that he could raise $1 million of money in no time, whereas he has most likely the pawn ticket of his Sunday's coat in his pocket. And now mark that elderly, sedate, quiet-looking man, whose good black suit is well brushed and his boots nicely polished. He compares his heavy gold watch with the clock of Bow Church, and is quite delighted to see that his time is correct to a second. And now he continues his way without looking to the right or the left. He knows every feature, every shop, every lamp-post of Cheapside and the Poultry too well to have any farther curiosity about those thoroughfares, for he has passed along that way every morning, Sundays excepted, during the last 20 years. Are you not prepared to make an affidavit that he is a superior clerk in the Bank of England? But we must abandon any farther scrutiny of the several members of the crowd in Cheapside, at least for the present, because it is now 9:30, and Mr. Greenwood has reached Cornhill. Here he paused and sighed deeply. That sigh told a long and painful history of how he had lately been rich and prosperous, how he had lost all by grasping at more, and how he was now reduced almost to the very verge of penury, and how he wondered whether he should ever be wealthy and great again. Yes, I will be, he said to himself, speaking not with his lips, but with that silent though emphatic tongue which belongs to the soul. My good star cannot have deserted me forever, but this day must show. Then, calling all his assurance to his aid, he turned into the office of a well-known merchant and capitalist on Cornhill. The clerk did not immediately recognize him, for the last time he had called there it was at 4 in the afternoon, and he had alighted from an elegant cab, whereas now it was 9:30 in the morning, and he had evidently come on foot. But when he demanded in his usual authoritative tone whether their master had arrived yet, they recollected him and replied in the affirmative. Greenwood accordingly walked into the merchant's private office. "Ah, my dear sir," he said, extending his hand towards the merchant, "how do you find yourself? It is almost an age since we met." The merchant affected not to perceive the outstretched hand, nor did he return the bland smile with which Mr. Greenwood accosted him, but just raising his eyes from the morning paper which lay before him, he said in a cold tone, "Ah, Mr. Greenwood, I believe? Pray, sir, what is your business?" The ex-member for Rottenborough took a chair uninvited and proceeded to observe in a confidential kind of whisper. "The fact is, my dear sir, I have conceived a magnificent project for making a few thousand into as many millions, I may say. And as on former occasions, you and I have done some little business together, and I have put a few good things into your way. I thought I would give you the refusal of my new design. And I am really infinitely obliged to you, Mr. Greenwood." "Oh, I knew you would be, my dear sir," interrupted the ex-member. "The risk is nothing, the gains certain and enormous. You and I can keep it all to ourselves, and—" "You require me to advance the funds, I presume?" asked the merchant, eyeing his visitor askance. "Just so, a few thousand only, to be repaid out of the first proceeds, of course," returned Greenwood. Then, sir, I beg to decline the speculation, said the merchant dryly. Speculation? It is not a speculation, said Greenwood. It is a certainty. Nevertheless, sir, I must decline it, and as my time is very much occupied— Oh, I shall not intrude upon you any longer, interrupted Greenwood indignantly, and he strode out of the office. The impertinent scoundrel, he muttered to himself when he had gained the street. After all the good things I have placed in his way to treat me in this manner. But never mind. Let me once grow rich again, and I will humble him at my feet. In spite of this attempt at self-consolation, Greenwood was deeply mortified with the reception which he had experienced at the merchant's office. His anger had, however, cooled, and his spirits revived by the time he reached Birchin Lane, where dwelt another of his city acquaintances. This individual was a capitalist who had once been saved from serious embarrassment, if not total ruin, by a timely advance of funds made to him by Greenwood, and though the capitalist had paid enormous interest for the accommodation, he had nevertheless always exhibited the most profound gratitude toward the ex-member for Rottenborough. It was therefore with great confidence that Greenwood entered the private office of the capitalist. "Oh, my dear fellow," cried the latter, apparently overjoyed to see his visitor, "how have you been lately? Why, it really is an age since I have seen you. Pray sit down, and now say, what can I do for you?" Greenwood addressed him in terms similar to those which he had used with the merchant a few minutes previously. "And so you actually have a scheme that will make millions, my dear Greenwood?" said the capitalist, his entire countenance beaming with smiles. "Just as I tell you," answered the ex-member. "And you have considered it in all its bearings?" "In every shape and way, success is certain." "Oh, what a lucky dog you are," cried the capitalist, playfully thrusting his fingers into Greenwood's ribs. "Well, I can't say that I'm lucky," observed the latter in a measured tone. "I have had losses lately, serious losses, but you know that I am not the man to be long in remedying them." "Far from it, my boy," exclaimed the capitalist. "You will make an enormous fortune before you die, I am sure you will, and this new scheme of yours, although you have only hinted darkly at it, must succeed. I am convinced it must." "Then you are prepared to join me in the project?" said Greenwood. "Nothing would give me greater pleasure, my friend," said the capitalist, "but it is impossible." "Impossible? How can that be, since you think so well of anything that I may devise?" asked Greenwood. "God bless your soul," cried the other. "Money is money nowadays. For my part, I can't think where the devil it all gets to. One hears of it, reads of it, but never sees it. In fact," he added, sinking his voice to a mysterious whisper, "I do believe that there is no such thing now as money in the whole city." "Ridiculous!" exclaimed Greenwood. "Complaints from you are absurd, because everyone knows that you have made an enormous fortune since that time when I was so happy to save you from bankruptcy." "Yes, yes," said the capitalist, "I remember that incident. I have never forgot it, as I always told you I never would." "Then in plain terms," continued Greenwood, "do me the service of advancing 2,000 or 3,000 pounds to set my new project in motion." "Impossible, Greenwood, impossible!" cried the capitalist, buttoning up his breeches pockets. "Things are in such a state that I would not venture a penny upon the most feasible speculation in the world." "Perhaps you will lend me a sum—" "Lend? Ah, no, really, Greenwood, this is too good. Lend, indeed! What, when we are all in the borrowing line in the city?" And the capitalist chuckled as if he had uttered a splendid joke. "In one word, then," said Greenwood, relishing this mirth as little as a person in his situation was likely to do, "will you assist my temporary wants, even if you do not choose to enter into my speculation? You know that I am proud, and that it must pain me thus to speak to you, but I declare most solemnly that 50 pounds at this moment would be of the greatest service to me." "Nothing gives me more pain than to refuse a friend like you," answered the capitalist, "but positively I could not part with a shilling today to save my own brother from jail." Greenwood rose, put on his hat, and left the office without uttering another word. He felt that he was righteously punished, for he had in his time often treated men in the same manner, professing ardent friendship and yet refusing the smallest pecuniary favor. Having walked about for nearly half an hour to calm the feelings which the conduct of the capitalist had so painfully excited, Greenwood repaired to the office of a great bill discounter and speculator in Broad Street. This individual had been a constant visitor at Greenwood's house in Spring Gardens, had joined him in many of his most profitable speculations, and had gained considerable sums thereby. He was, moreover, of a very enterprising character, and always ready to risk money with the hope of large returns. Greenwood entered the clerk's office, and glancing toward the private one at the lower extremity, he caught sight of the speculator's countenance peering over the blinds of the glass door which opened between the two rooms. The face was instantly withdrawn, and Greenwood, who of course affected not to have observed its appearance at the window, inquired whether the speculator was within. "Really, I can't say, sir," drawled a clerk who was mending a pen. Then, without desisting from his operation, he said, "I'll see sir in a moment." "Be so kind as to see this moment," exclaimed Greenwood angrily. "I suppose you know who I am." "Oh, yes, sir, certainly, sir," returned the clerk, and having duly nibbed the pen, he dismounted very leisurely from his stool, paused to arrange a piece of blotting paper on the desk in a very precise manner indeed, brushed the splinters of the quill from his trousers, and then dragged himself in a lazy fashion towards the private office. Greenwood bit his quivering lip with rage. 2 years ago, he thought to himself, I should not have been treated thus. Meantime, the clerk entered the inner office and carefully closed the door behind him. Greenwood could hear the murmuring sound of 2 voices within. At length the clerk reappeared and said in a careless tone, "The governor isn't in, Mr. Greenwood. I thought he was, but he isn't, and what's more, I don't know when he will be. You'd better look in again if it's particular, but I know the governor's uncommon busy today." "I shall not trouble you nor your governor any more," returned Greenwood, his heart ready to break at the cool, deliberate insult thus put upon him. "You think me a fallen man, and you dare to treat me thus, but—" "Why, as for that," interrupted the clerk with impertinent emphasis, everyone knows you're broke and done up, and my governor doesn't want shabby insolvents hanging about his premises." Greenwood's countenance became scarlet as these bitter taunts met his ears, and for a moment he felt inclined to rush upon the insolent clerk and punish him severely with his cane. But being naturally of a cool and cautious disposition, he perceived with a second thought that he might only become involved in a dilemma from which he had no means to extricate himself. So, conquering his passion, he rushed out of the office. He could now no longer remain blind to the cruel conviction that the extremities of his position were well known in the city, and that the hopes with which he had sallied forth 3 hours previously were mere delusive visions. Still he was resolved to leave no stone unturned in the endeavor to retrieve his ruined fortunes, but feeling sick at heart and the prey to a deep depression of spirits, he plunged hastily into a public house to take some refreshment. And now behold the once splendid and fastidious Greenwood, the man who had purchased the votes of a constituency, and had even created a sensation within the walls of Parliament, the individual who had discounted bills of large amount for some of the greatest peers of England, and whose luxurious mode of living had once been the envy and wonder of the fashionable world. Behold the ex-member for Rottenborough partaking of a pint of porter and a crust of bread and cheese in the dingy parlour of a public house. There was a painful knitting of the brows, and there was a nervous quivering of the lip, which denoted the acute emotions to which he was a prey, as he partook of his humble fare, and once 2 large tears trickled down his cheeks and moistened the bread that he was conveying to his mouth. For he thought of the times when money was as dirt in his estimation, when he rode in splendid vehicles, sat down to sumptuous repasts, was ministered unto by a host of servants in gorgeous liveries, and revelled in the arms of the loveliest women of the metropolis. Oh, he thought of all this. He recalled to mind the well-filled wardrobes he had once possessed, and glanced at his present faded attire. He shook up the remains of the muddy beer at the bottom of the pewter pot, and remembered the gold he had lavished on champagne. His eyes lingered upon the crumbs of the bread and the rind of cheese left on the plate, and his imagination became busy with the reminiscences of the turtle and venison that had once smoked upon his board. But worse, oh, far worse than this was the dread conviction that all his lavish expenditure, all his ostentatious displays, all his princely feasts had failed to secure him a single friend. No wonder, then, that the bitter, bitter tears started from his eyes, and though he immediately checked that first ebullition of heartfelt anguish, yet the effort only caused the storm of emotions to rage the more painfully within his breast. For, in imagination, he cast his eyes towards a mansion a few miles distant, and there he beheld one whose condition formed a striking contrast with his own, one who had suddenly burst from obscurity and created for himself as proud a name as might be found in Christendom, a young man whose indomitable energies and honorable aspirations had enabled him to lead armies to conquest, and who had taken his place among the greatest princes in the universe. The comparison which Greenwood drew, despite of himself, between the elevated position of Richard Markham and his own fallen, ruined lot, produced feelings so painful, so exquisitely agonizing in nature, that he could endure them no longer. He felt that they were goading him to madness, the more so because he was alone in that dingy parlour at the time, and was therefore the least likely to struggle against them successfully. Hastily quitting the public house, he rushed into the street where the fresh air seemed to do him good. And then he asked himself whether he should risk farther insult by calling upon other wealthy men with whom he had once been on intimate terms. For a few moments he was inclined to abandon the idea, but a little calm reflection told him not to despair. Moreover, he had a reason, a powerful motive for exerting all his energies to repair the past, so far as his worldly fortunes were concerned, and though the idea was almost insane, he hoped, if he had but a chance, to make such good use of the coming few weeks as would reinstate him in the possession of enormous wealth. But alas, it seemed as if no one would listen to the scheme which he felt convinced was calculated to return millions for the risk of a few thousand. Oh, I must retrieve myself, I must make a fortune, he thought as he hurried toward Moorgate Street. One lucky stroke, and 24 hours shall see me rich again. This idea brought a smile to his lips, and relaxing his pace, he composed his countenance as well as he could ere he entered the office of a wealthy stockbroker in Moorgate Street. The stockbroker was lounging over the clerk's desk, conversing with a merchant whom Greenwood also knew, and the moment the ex-member for Rottenborough entered, the two city gentlemen treated him to a long, impertinent, and contemptuous stare. "Ah," said Greenwood, affecting a pleasant smile, which God knows did not come from the heart, "you do not appear to recollect me. Am I so very much changed as all that?" "Well, it is, Greenwood, positively," drawled the stockbroker, turning towards his friend the merchant in a manner that was equivalent to saying, "I wonder at his impudence in coming here." "Yes, it is, Greenwood," observed the merchant, pulling his glasses up to his eyes, "or rather the shadow of Greenwood, I should take it to be." "Ah, ha, 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 ha," chuckled the stockbroker. "You are disposed to be facetious, gentlemen," said the object of this intended witticism, but really galling insult. "I presume that my long absence from the usual city haunts—" "I can assure you, Greenwood," interrupted the stockbroker, "that the city has gotten on uncommonly well without you. The bank hasn't stopped payment, bills are easy of discount, money is plentiful." "And yet," said Greenwood, determined to receive all this sarcasm as quietly as a poor devil ought to do when about to make a proposal requiring an abundance of funds, "and yet a certain capitalist, a very intimate friend of mine in Birchin Lane, assured me just now that money was very scarce." The stockbroker and merchant laughed together. "Why, the fact is, Greenwood," continued the broker, "your very intimate friend, the capitalist, was here only a quarter of an hour ago, and he delighted us hugely by telling us how you called upon him this morning with a scheme that would make millions, and ended by wanting to borrow £50 of him." Again the merchant chuckled. Once more laughed the stockbroker, and taking his friend's arm, he led him into his private office, the two continuing to laugh and chuckle until the door closed behind them. Greenwood now became aware of the gratifying fact that every clerk in the counting-house was laughing also, and he rushed out into the street, a prey to the feelings of the most agonizing nature. But the ignominy of that day was not yet complete in respect to him. As he darted away from the door of the insolent stockbroker's office, he came in collision with two gentlemen who were walking arm in arm toward the bank. "'Pon my honour, good fellow," began one, rubbing his arm, which had been hurt by the encounter. "Greenwood!" cried the second, stepping back in surprise. The ex-member for Rottenborough raised his eyes at the sound of these well-known voices, and beheld Mr. Chichester, with his inseparable friend the baronet, both eyeing him in the most insulting manner. "Ah, Greenwood, my dear fellow," exclaimed Sir Rupert, "I am really quite delighted to see you. How get on the free and independent electors of Rottenborough? Egad, though, you are not quite the pink of fashion that you used to be, when you did me the honour of making my wife your mistress." "Greenwood and Berlin wool gloves, impossible!" cried Chichester. "Such a companionship is quite unnatural." "And an old coat brushed up to look like a new one," added the baronet, laughing heartily. "And the Bluchers!" Greenwood stayed to hear no more. He broke from the hold which the two friends had laid upon him, and darted down an alley into Coleman Street. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. We'll see what happens in the next one.